Okay. So hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Ivana Kadiewska. I'm sorry for the problems for pronouncing. Ivana is a younger associate at the State Archives of North Macedonia. She gained her BA in 2018 and her master's degree in 2021, both in the field of history. And she received the award for Best Achievement in Studying from the university's rectorate. Her research interests include social history, philosophy of history, and remembrance culture. She currently works as a researcher on international projects concerning the accessibility of historical sources for women's history and development of epistemic potentials of local archival collections. Most recently, she co-authored the book Invisible Archives, Makedonka Organ of the WAF, 1944-1952, Historical Experiences and Cultural Memory. She's very fond of discussions on cinema and critical theory, and she's fan of Luis Buñuel, the Spanish filmmaker. So thank you, Ivana, for being here. And you have the floor. You can share your screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just a minute. So before I start, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers, Professor Amelia and Professor Katja, for accepting my presentation and thus the opportunity to talk about my experience, my research in the frames of the Invisible Archives project on this important webinar series. Because there is always this joyous hope that through this kind of public presentations, we could reach new readers or that we can inspire students to further develop knowledge concepts and further develop critical thinking about the past. Also, I would like to make a special mention and a thank you note to Jana Kocewska, my principal colleague in this project, that I'm going to talk about, and I believe that she's following us today, so I thank her for that and thank her for her time. So I would like to start now with a personal anecdote. I was a second-year student of history around 2016, and I was doing research in the National Library in Skopje on a paperwork concerning periodical studies from the Macedonian context from the first half of the 20th century. And while I was going through catalogs, I came across the magazine Makedonka, the title Makedonka, organ of Women's Anti-Fascist Front of Macedonia, and it was the very first issue of that magazine. It was from 1944, and actually it was the first magazine from Macedonian history at all that was edited by women, and it was dedicated to women audience. And for the very first time as a student of history, I have actually came across a source from the Macedonian context where women's stories were positioned in the center. So women's experience from the war, from the Second World War, got their place in the center. Also, there was this abundance of documentation and presentation of their participation in politics and in institutions in the after-war period. And it was all here, and it was mesmerizing. But after this kind of initial enthusiasm, I have noticed that I actually miss, as a historian, I miss the tools of historiographical and theoretical articulation of this material. So it was this type of moment as a researcher when I also noticed some kind of meta dilemma in myself, that it was about the structure of academic knowledge itself, especially on knowledge about master narratives and the ways in which they are presented and distributed to us. So again, it was this moment that before I start, I must mention it, the moment of my personal position and the political context I am as a reader of this documentation, but also as a researcher and as a historian in the current context. So then again, that was one part of the initiation in the research, in its preconception, I would say, because at the same time, it was also this counterpoint context. As I said, I didn't have some tools to go further and to critically articulate these important sources of women's history, but at the same time, I must mention that I had regional examples. For example, I was very inspired exactly in that same period about a project about women's sources from the anti-fascist struggle. There was the going on of the digitization of the AFG archival collection by the collective Crvena in Sarajevo, and their monography that was very important for me to gain this kind of theoretical framework. And then I was acquainted with the Knjiženstvo project from Belgrade, from Serbia, that was also presented in this webinar earlier. And then I was acquainted with the Ženski Pokret bibliography, monography, the whole project about the magazine Ženski Pokret and its digitization, the accessibility of it online, and all these connections through research collectives and through communities around, also not only academic research, but also communities that are around regional feminist festivals, made me much more epistemic, helped me to position myself epistemically in the whole process. And exactly through these connections that started, as I said, in the somewhere in my student years, exchange of literature, interesting communities of researchers around women's history beyond academic ivory or institutional ivory towers, if we can call them like that. I have came in contact with the Skopje-based feminist activist and anthropologist Jana Kocevska, and somewhere in already in 2020, we have already started from preconception and with her knowledge from this topic. We have started our collaboration. We have officialized our ideas in kind of a project framework that was conceptualized as Invisible Archives project, and then we started formulating methodologies suitable to frame historiographically and in terms of humanities all these important sources from women's history that we had in hand. But again, I will stay just a little bit in this introduction part to speak more about, to bring audience closer, why I want to connect the research on women's sources with national historiographies, with master narratives, because I think that it is very important, as I said, that kind of meta process that's going behind the scenes of every research, because every research is based in some context, and the critical thinking can be either elevated or it can be somehow scratched through the political going-ons in a society and so on. And that's why these communities of researchers sometimes are a counterpoint to processes like that. And for an example, the political context of the project Skopje 2014, it was very connected to this kind of revisionism towards women's history in the frames of the national narratives. It was as some kind of striping of the historical narratives from their universal message, and almost always placing these narratives in some eccentric or essentialist position. All the narratives of the past are put in some kind of essentialist position, and thus many social groups in that kind of position, many social groups lose their histories in that opulence of the master narrative that can be really strongly embedded in culture. And I'm not going to go into details about the project Skopje for 2014. It was actually a nation branding project that was going on in Macedonia in the shown period. It was embedded into this kind of conservative ideology. And when it comes to women, they were shown into this romanticized romanticism towards women's participation in national struggles, or oblivion to actually what kind of position they have in the politics of the state building, of the nation building. And actually, when I try to theoretically put this into words, I came to a great explanation used from the anthropologist Renata Jambesic-Kiren, and she saw this kind of phenomenon that happened in every post-Yugoslav society, and she can explain this kind of revisionism through the term crisis of the woman's archive. And that implies that all comprehensive collection of documents, of the countless volumes of literature that were published during the socialist period, where women's position was to the prism of communism and equality between men and women. And when this change in the 90s came, they could no longer stimulate new historiographical research, because the publications themselves have in the course of time became monuments of the historicist discourse, drawn among the other revolutionary paraphilia, as she brilliantly states. And then she concludes that the consequence of this exclusion of women from the sphere of power and politically relevant sphere of power, of knowledge, is the best proof of historical experiences and cultural memory for the autocratic, controversial, and unfinished modernization that we actually got in our countries after the in the transition in the 1990s. And the project Skopje 2014 and its gender dimension of master narrative is excellent example, is an explicit example of processes like that. So in that sense, I must also agree with another woman, with the historian Gordana Stojakovic, when she says that historical memory is a prerequisite to achieve social changes in the present. So that's how we have imagined into our project to go into this kind of also philosophical conceptualizing of the past, of politics of memory. And it is also important, as well as that part of the project, that we go into methodology, that we go into academic analysis and so on, but we also have in mind this kind of cultural field that processes also occur. And now, just to make a brief introduction to the project that I have mentioned, the project Invisible Archive. I have prepared something very brief, like Invisible Archives 101. So in the period between 2020 and 2022, the Center for Research of Nationalism and Culture, it's an organization based in Skopje, CINIC, has worked on the project concerning women's history entitled Invisible Archives. The research project was led by anthropologist Jana Kocevska and historian Ivana Mi, with working participation from a team with an international character. So Invisible Archives is a theoretically and methodologically designed project, the purpose of which is to offer systematized sources through which a broader picture of the representation of women in the narratives of the Macedonian past can be presented, but it can be presented beyond this kind of stereotypical imagology, as well as to give contemporary humanist analysis of the sources in the context of the position of women in national master narratives. and to see where can this epistemic bring us today. So it's somehow a history writing or academic analysis of sources, but that it's always looking to some kind of didactic structure of where this knowledge bring us today, how can it help to social groups that it's talking about. So the main results, there were many. The main results from the projects, I can summarize them with showing the two monographies, collections of academic texts, of research texts that have resulted from the project. So in the first year, we have issued the monography about women in the periodicals from the territory of Vardar, Macedonia, between the two world wars. So it was important for us to also show this kind of prehistory of women's movements when they were not that organized. Before this kind of revolutionary anti-fascist struggle that was much more organized during the Second World War. So it has this kind of it gives chronological structure to our project research as a whole. And then the second monography, the last monography of the project, is actually, as you can read on the slide, it's focused completely on Macedonca, or organ of Women's Anti-Fascist Front of Macedonia. And it is about the historical experience and the cultural memory that it's embedded into Macedonca as a source and as a first and only back then magazine that was written by women. So at the same time, the research also established, as I said, practical goal that is almost always submitted by national institutes, in our case, by national institutes of historical sciences, of humanities, and that is to place the results into some institutional context, to connect them with their educational perspective, and also to connect them with the need of their digital accessibility. So put in a practical reference, the project also resulted with the two monographies that I mentioned above, and also with the educational web outlet Invisible Nevidljivi arhivi.mk. So as you can see, there is we have created some kind of web platform that can be used to link all important sources that can be digitized by us as a team and with help of different institutions. And it can be also used as a platform with many educational tools, and it can develop life of its own later when we have another research and so on. So in the first project year, as I said, it was 2021 first, and we had also these challenges with the corona epidemics, and it was also meant challenges with institutional access, not only digital access, but institutional access to libraries, to archives at all. So that's what we did then is this kind of we saw that challenge as an opportunity to actually dive into the sources that we already had in hand, that were already public into the digital libraries in our country. And because there was, as I said, Macedonca was the first women's magazine. Before the Second World War, we didn't have Macedonian language magazine or outlets that were connected specifically to women. But what we did is maybe something even more interesting from a research point of view, because we started to dive into this kind of documenting of the generation of women that were active in the public and the political arena in various periodicals. And periodicals were for us very interesting because they can show this a variety of situations, events connected with the culture, with the literature, with the language, that can emulate in what kind of political positions could women operate in that kind of patriarchal post-Ottoman times that were going on the territory that we were focusing on. So what we did was actually this kind of connection through the sources, some kind of navigation through the sources with the creation of a bibliography. So bibliographies, I can now surely conclude, are an excellent tool to go on and to document the existence of women's participation in public life. So we have documented women and made a bibliography of their appearance into 3 magazines that were active and important also for this kind of gender dimension that we were focused on. Those were the magazines Illustration Ilinden, Luch or Lux, it can be translated like that, and Smena. The first one was on a Bulgarian language. The second and the third one were in Serbian language, and they're also reflecting the historical context back then. But what is much more important is these excerpts that I have here, that I have shown here, because it was an opportunity for us to show that also in these various magazines, we can make a connection, and we can actually find a full biographical note of a woman that was women that were active in some kind of humanitarian, educational, or political aspect of the public life. And what we got here is actually one example of that, and then to connect them with this kind of register of names of women that have appeared in the 3 magazines that I have mentioned. So what we have here is actually the bibliography. So we can see that in passages of the bibliography, of the entries, like this one that are highlighted, we can also connect the name of the women with the name of the registry and connect it with her kind of biography note that shows her more about her work in the public sphere and how she was mentioned in public discourse. And this kind of unveils this notion that exists in almost today also in our historiography, that women were not present or that were invisible. So we actually, with our terminological association to invisibility, struggle to find out what kind of invisibility was, so in what way they were present. And actually this kind of documentation with the tools of bibliographies, registers, indexes, it's very, very important. And it almost, I don't think that it's a boring tool, also it may sound like that, but it's actually something that can be treated like a detective story, and we can find out many things about women that we didn't know that existed, but they were very active in their own time. So now about the second monography that is focused on Macedonka, the magazine that I have started with, is or the magazine that I have mentioned that is very important for women's history in our national context, because it's the first magazine that is edited from women, and it is dedicated to explicitly to the emancipation, political and economic emancipation of women in the context of socialist Macedonia. So it has a lot of meanings, and I would say that there are 3 layers of meanings that are especially important for this kind of research, and were important for me as a historian, because on one way, the history of the magazine Macedonka is made of at least 3 major temporal lines. Also, it tells the story about the developments in the national and state history, as I mentioned. It unravels the development lines of women's movement and emancipation in the 20th century in our context, in the local or regional context also, and its eventual clear political formulation in the form of an executive magazine from the Women's Anti-Fascist Front that was a political front organization of the Communist Party of Macedonia during World War II, and it can also show the lifespan of the publication itself in terms of media and communication, in terms of a magazine, because it shows the development and presence of this kind of publication of magazine in the culture of memory, from a living medium to a historical source today. So the position of the magazine as the principal medium about women's issues in the society, as it was stated in its program from the very first issue, remained closely linked to the needs of the state upon which it was based, and consequently the political and ideological changes in the socialist state that affected the goals and the visions of the magazine, the change of the editors through its lifespan. And in a crucial way, that greatly suppressed the influence of the leaders of the organization of the Women's Anti-Fascist Front, which also underwent political reorganization in the 1950s. So the magazine was called, this is a very interesting aspect that I like to mention, because it's connected to also this temporal line of how emancipation notions change from the country top down. So this is brilliantly shown through the lifespan of the magazine and its changes. So the same magazine that was called Makedonka until 1952, it was renamed into Prosvetena žena, or Enlightened Woman, organ of the Women's Societies of Macedonia in 1953, after the reorganization of the Women's Anti-Fascist Front in Yugoslavia. And then in the 1990s, the magazine was renamed again, and this time the new name was Woman. But things get interesting in the later 1990s, because later into until the early 2000s, it was again renamed, and this time the name was Handsome, Zgodna, or Handsome. So it expressed in terms of feminist hermeneutics. By following the changes in the title of this periodical, we can also follow the changes in women's emancipation idea, starting with socialism and then ending with the period of transition in the 1990s, and something that author Liliana Burcar calls repatriarchalization in the last couple of, that is going on in the last couple of decades, but still goes on today. So I would also, I will move on to some other examples, but I recommend to the readers, to interested audiences, to go to the introduction of this. The monographies that I have mentioned are accessible free and online to our website, so they can go and see the ID card of the magazines that we as researchers have developed, and then to have some interested statistic to read interesting statistics about the magazine, but also some gems in its content. And also, when I'm talking about this kind of interesting gems that can be found through the content, I must mention or like make three portraits of the magazine Makedonka and its aspects that are mainly that can mostly be divided into two structuring lines. And one structure of the magazine is the aspect of the magazine and the creation of women as authors, women as executive editors, and on the other side is this important aspect of the magazine as creator of the woman reader. So not only the author, but how women readers were molded through this official outlet of official women's organization from socialist period. So on one side, we have this kind of interesting and very inspiring story about a known political figure as the portrait of the first executive editor of the magazine, Veselinka Malinska. She was editor in the period between 1944 and 1947. And we can, through the magazine, through the text that she has written, we can know much more about her, her officially summarized biography, political biography that is much, I can use the term ideologically compressed by the party structure, but what should be represented as an official portrait of a woman politician from socialist time. But here in Makedonka, we can find out much more about her ideological attitudes, about her political thought through her texts. And then to go on other examples, how the woman author is created, we can find maybe much more not that kind of strict political portrait, but also a portrait of a woman that becomes an author through her participation into the editing process of the magazine. So for me, it was an excellent example, and I didn't know about this example. It's about the author Nevena Teoharova. So she's quite an anonymous character, to say it like that. She was not politician. She was not a participator into the national liberation struggle. She was not woman partisan. But through her work and dedication into longer periods of the magazine Makedonka, she started first as someone that was a reporter, that was only reporting texts from other authors, and then on that way on, she started, let's call it with some kind of shyness, but she overcome that kind of stage. And then we have her like this example on the slide. As an author, she started to write her own prose and poetry texts for the magazine Makedonka. And that's an interesting example because back then the prose and poetry circles were somehow enclosed to women's participation. And I'm pretty sure that in a discussion about women's entrance into this kind of poetry circles, some literature study researcher can much more give a detailed report why was that kind of gender dimension put onto this poetry and literature circles. But for me was very interesting how Nevena Teoharova somehow, through her participation as an author of content into the magazine, somehow elevated herself as a full author that gives her signature at an end of a prose or a poetry, not only a journalistic report. And then the magazine Makedonka, it also has a lot of gems connected to transnational aspects, to transnational narratives about women writers that were put on the pages of magazines connected to the work of anti-fascist women's organization in Yugoslavia. And that is the case with the author, just a second, the case with the author Maria Alexandrovna Vilinska, that was a writer in these magazines, these outlets of AFG, through her synonym Marko Vovčk. And I would really like to recommend, I will not go into details now, I'm only mentioning these kind of interesting examples, but I would recommend anyone that is interested in this kind of transnational translation of women's participation in literature to go to our monography and read the text by the author Manja Veličkovska, that is giving some more details about this author that was writing under pseudonym. So my point with this slide was to give interested readers some kind of little window towards what kind of literature it holds. It's not only connected to political aspect of agitprop or propaganda about women's emancipation that was in general part of the top-down politics of emancipation by the Communist Party, but it also we can find many aspects about this kind of women becoming a reader, women becoming author inside that top-down approach. But we can never go into such details as readers, as researchers, if source collections are secluded into institutions, and if there is not so much access towards them, and the challenges that we had with institutions and access there during times of pandemics or movement of a researcher through many tenureships and so on, it can be very challenging to access a source. So we also had this idea to bring forward Makedonka digitally, to have access to it, and that meant that before that we did a thorough research to our institutions' libraries back at home, and it was very interesting that the full collection of the magazine Makedonka can be found only into the National Library of Serbia in Belgrade. And thankfully, with a gratitude to the staff of librarians that work in the National Library of Serbia, we are able to have the magazine in a digital form, and it's all issues of the magazine Makedonka can be assessed digitally through they're linked on our website, but they are actually part of the digital library of the National Library of Serbia. So that was also a milestone for us as researchers to have that kind of accessibility to the first women's magazine from our context. And that kind of collaboration between institutions and between researchers that are part of projects done by organizations must be put also in the context of this regional diaspora. I like to use that term when experiences are shared, but also very important informations can be shared through countries. So we didn't like to stay into this kind of lonely island in our own local context, because always the regional collaboration can bring much more joy in the work as a researcher, but also as we see with the digitization process, it can bring also materializations of good ideas that can never be done if we stay secluded in our kind of local island. So this work also it always has regional and transnational stamp, and we wanted to actually discuss about those issues that come or those regional experiences with archiving and studying women's history. So also the paths of preservation and sharing are always transnational, I would say, because there are shared narratives, there are historically shared points on that path that are now reflected into our institutions. So that's why when on the first project year, when we were promoting the first monography, there was also this important conference that took place under the title that is stated here into the slide. And we had the participation of researchers that already went through big processes in their own communities, in their own workplaces. And we collected their kind of experiences, and we opened a debate about the topics about preservation and sharing sources of women's history. So for me, that regional diaspora, as I mentioned, almost on the beginning of my presentation, was always this kind of counterpoint into the participation of women's history in the culture of memory. And then again, I really like to exhibit also examples of discussions that took place on the promotion of the second monography. We again opened the debate about the experiences across research, the experience that go not only into the academic research, but also exit it and go into the realm of activism and artistic practices that can be really important to elevate the research, to bring it forward to students, to citizens that can be interested about it. So we also had another round table when we gathered people that are participators from different kind into this culture of memory. So under the title Perspectives of the Research of the First Macedonian Women's Magazine Makedonka, individual, institutional, and public dimension, because it seems that these dimensions are also important parts if we want to have a wholesome research results. So there are some kind of mnemonic points in our society that hold onto memories, dedicated memories and traditions from the anti-fascist struggle that sometimes can bear much more that can hold on to these sources much better than institutions, if I can make a point like that. And also there are these kind of communities of researchers that are part of institutions or independent researchers that form a community dedicated to a certain topic, and on that way they can deliver greater results than some kind of slow or inert process that would go on only on an institutional path. So it was very important to gather different experiences from these different mnemonic parts. And the life of the sources research in the project Invisible Archives after project ending can have will go on to another front of work. And that front for us is the stepping out into the public sphere beyond academia towards the transforming of public history, transforming the canons of literature, culture, and historiography. And that's where we collide with the topic of critique towards methodological nationalism. And my personal conclusion from my part of the research on this project as a historian was always connected with the issues of epistemology, as I started early in the beginning of the presentation. And in this case, one can conclude that the history of women from the pages of Makedonka and other used sources during our work uncovers new paradigm about the national past, and it dwells with the gender dimension of the past that is somehow repressed or omitted, but it at the same time it repressed and omits a whole part of our narratives of our past. And as I started, I will also close my presentation with an anecdote from the current situation. I have recently read that official church representatives were preparing a big public meeting protest against the term gender equality, among other terms, other things and terms from what they call gender ideology and so on. And then my first association was that in the constitutional documents of our country, of our state, gender equality is almost initiated and presented through women's organizations and political works. So institutions that are presenting themselves as national warriors are actually omitting that kind of past connected to gender equality that was already initiated into the nation building. So the contemporary study of sources such as Makedonka, especially when they can be assessed online, and especially when they are put in the context of digital humanities, can only bring forward emancipated knowledge that can fight back even against contemporary backlash. Thank you.